You know of the warp, and have seen its malevolent influence. This is chaos. Now it has touched humanity, twisting the best among us. All we can do now is remain true to ourselves, expel and reject it. Trying to understand it is a foolish endeavor. It will enslave us too. Of all the countless horrors of the dark future, few can compare in ruthlessness and madness to the servants of the ruinous powers. The dark gods are very selective of their followers, and to draw their attention requires something truly monumental. Perhaps that is why any tales of the heretics' depredations will appear as, at best, an understatement of the true scale of madness. Yet only those who have long rejected the Emperor's light can truly grasp the meaning of dark rituals. However, in their pursuit of destruction, the followers of chaos are far from altruistic. Most of them, be they a cultist from the lower levels of the hive, or a chaos lord under whose feet hundreds of worlds have burned, gladly accept the gifts of their masters. And there is no reward more coveted for a mortal servant than a place among those he once worshipped. Ascension, liberation from the shackles of mortal flesh, true immortality, rebirth in the form of a demon. And though only a few have even a chance for such divine favor, and the path to ascension inevitably lies through thousands of ruined souls, few can resist such a temptation, be they mortal, Astartes or Primarch. Those who once overthrew the sanctuaries of the false and deluded called themselves gods. Those who brought the light of truth to the stars now spread nothing but darkness and sorrow. And for what? Vanity, simple vanity, and we all pay for it with blood. The betrayal of Horus forever changed the face of the galaxy and impacted the fates of billions, including his brothers. Most of the Primarchs who sided with the arch-traitor were subsequently granted the highest rewards by the dark gods. Primarch Angron became the embodiment of carnage, Magnus was reborn as the Red Cyclops, Mortarion took the form of the Black-Winged Death. Lorgar acquired boundless power and knowledge and forever lost interest in the mortal realm, and Fulgrim, who took on a shape similar to the Lyre, a Xenos race he once destroyed himself. The ascension of each of these Primarchs was indeed a grand event. But the Primarch of the Third Legion, in his love for theatrics, surpassed all his brothers. The Phoenician never liked to share the audience's attention with anyone, but now, as Perturabo saw, he had become narcissistic to the point of egomania, his brother pacing the stage theatrically. A great actor, strolling before delivering his greatest monologue, finally struck a heroic pose, more reminiscent of an actor portraying Fulgrim than Fulgrim himself. The story of the Phoenicians' apotheosis began with betrayal. An exile from the Elder race once told Fulgrim about a planet located in the very heart of the greatest warp storm in the galaxy, and about a safe path to it. The Xeno's motives remain unknown. Was he truly a traitor, or was he acting according to some plan? The truth died subsequently along with the Elder himself. However, knowing the deceitful nature of the Xenos, it is always worth assuming that the Elder was merely part of a far grander scheme, but be that as it may, his assistance was insufficient for such an expedition. Fulgrim required the help of one of his brothers, and no one fit this role better than the Primarch of the Fourth Legion. Like the rust of iron, guilt stains and corrodes the soul, gradually penetrating deeper until it unearths the very structure of the metal. However, if the whole world hates you and considers you vile, but you are pure before your own conscience, you will always find friends. The meeting of the brothers occurred some time after the events on Istvan, on the planet Hydrocordatus, where the Iron Warriors were storming the citadel of the Imperial Fists under the command of Captain Felix Cassander. The Imperial Fists had always been masters of defence, and the citadel was a true marvel of defensive fortification. However, the battle ended as soon as Perturabo himself appeared on the battlefield. The Imperial Fists simply had nothing to counter the might of a Primarch. The citadel was taken, and Cassander, along with a few survivors, were captured. The likelihood that the lives of the Imperial Fists in the hands of the Fourth Legion could be even somewhat long is quite small, however. Cassander and his warriors awaited a far more terrible fate. They were given as a gift to Fulgrim. Betrayal left its mark on all who sided with Horus, but some embraced the dark gods far more willingly than others. By then, the Emperor's children had already become a distorted parody of themselves. Although their Primarch still retained a human form, and Lucius had never been reborn, the Legion was already something akin to what it would become 10 millennia later. Near the landing site of the Emperor's Children, 3 kilometers from the entrance to the valley, there must have simultaneously commenced a triumphant parade and an uprising. This was the only reasonable explanation for the approaching sounds, colours and movements. 10,000 mortals led the vanguard of the Third Legion, a mad horde of screaming men and women bearing waving banners and creating a dissonant clamour with instruments that could not possibly have been made by a sane musician. Before the horde drifted billows of colourful, scented mist inflated by weakened ogrins, whose fitted armour was nailed to their skin with sharp spikes. Felix gazed at the approaching crowd with a mixture of anger and horror, at this carnival celebrating everything depraved and base known to man. The front ranks of the raving horde approached, shrouded in wisps of hallucinogenic mist, moving as if alive, eager to taste the sweat, breath and excretions of those who had created it. Thunderous cries were filled with rampant delight, agony and ecstasy simultaneously. They merged into a continuous cacophony, and the echo of this dissonance reverberated off the valley slopes like the manic ravings of thousands and thousands of madmen. Among the dancing crowd darted scarificator priests, armed with poisoned blades and chains adorned with hooks, who in joyous frenzy cut and flayed their charges, inflicting brutal torments upon them. If the tip of a venomous blade pierced an artery, the grateful victim would begin to convulse in a fierce choreo-maniacal fit. Witnessing this, others would start to imitate the death throes with screams, and thus the madness of the dance spread, becoming ever more elaborate. Soon the initial victim bled out, with blood spurting due to the frenzied heartbeat, and a new epicenter of dance fever erupted in the crowd. A mass psychogenic hysteria seized thousands of people, and they all moaned, screamed and laughed, as if at a festival or a wake. They fought and copulated, succumbing to the irresistible febrile rhythm that the Iron Warriors could not perceive. Banners soared above the procession, gonfalons and pennants fluttered, and the vivid images on the flags were simultaneously obscene and seductive, hideous and beautiful. Felix knew not what symbols were depicted on the banners, but their fluid contours induced a nauseating revulsion within him, with intertwining round forms and sensual curves, and the hard, rigid lines of spikes penetrating them. Yet all the shamelessness demonstrated by this procession could not compare to the physical deformities exhibited by some of its participants. Some defects were clearly congenital, others' bodies were mutilated by swords and maces in ritualistic duels, but most owed their physical pathologies to scalpels, medical sores, and genetic modifications. Some victims of these nightmarish surgical interventions were now forced to walk on their hands, as their legs were sewn to their shoulders and their faces had dropped to their bellies. Others, with crests on their backs resembling a hybrid of a centipede and a giant scorpion, gathered in frenzied packs, led by filthy cherubim bred in special vats. Naked women gyrated in dances, anointing their breasts with fragrant oils, with many flaunting an unnaturally high number of breasts that defied nature. Trailing these creatures with violet skin was an entire gang of screaming slaves and weeping fanatics. The crowd swayed and convulsed in spasms. Among them were those satisfied with mere dancing, others drawn by corruption, and some by violence. There were also those who screamed until their voices broke, until they were engulfed by blissful insanity. They mingled with hybrid monsters. And finally, those seeking the most extreme sensations set themselves ablaze and laughed, surrendering to the power of the flames. Although the Iron Warriors, along with their Primarch, were shocked by what the Third Legion had become in their pursuit of perfection, the meeting of the Primarchs went quite smoothly. The brothers exchanged gifts. Fulgrim received the survivors of the Imperial Fists. Perturabo, in response, received a fur mantle with a skull clasp, in the forehead of which was embedded a precious gem. Perturabo donned the mantle and fastened the skull clasp. Fulgrim smiled, seeing that his gift was well received, and turned his gaze to the red rocks and wastelands surrounding them. "What a dirty rock you've chosen for our meeting," he said. "I had my reasons," replied Perturabo. Welcome to Hydra Caudatus. What does that mean? Perturabo inquired gloomily when they returned to the heart of Cavea Ferrum. Means? Fulgrim responded, studying the portraits on the cracked stone walls with the detached interest of a connoisseur of fine arts. Who said everything has to mean something? Don't pretend you don't understand, said Perturabo. That horde beyond my walls. You disapprove of my entourage? Fulgrim inquired playfully. A crowd of degenerates is not for you, said Perturabo, pointing to his brother's companions, whose flesh was mutilated, armour disfigured, and notions of decency obliterated. And your legionaries, what has become of them? Aren't they magnificent? Of course, the meeting of two Primarchs in the midst of war could not occur simply due to a desire to see a brother. However, Fulgrim was in no hurry to reveal the essence of his visit. By his nature, he forced Perturabo to construct an entire theatre, arguing that his story was grand enough to be presented properly. Besides, for masters like the Iron Warriors, it would take just about a day. And so it happened. In 2 days, the warriors erected a grand structure called the Teleocron, on the stage of which Fulgrim recounted to his brother the legend of the angel Exterminatus, as he spoke of the birth of the Eldar gods, who aided the Xenos in their wars other races, and created a weapon so powerful and terrible that the Eldar themselves burned with hatred both toward it and its creator. The betrayed angels Exterminatus and the weapon they created were forever locked in the center of a colossal stellar vortex, a warp storm, which later, thanks to Perturabo, would become known as the Eye of Terror. However, at the very end of the story, something happened that none of the present could have expected. Primarch Fulgrim fell on the stage with a horrific wound in his head. Perturabo saw tiny drops of blood splattering from Fulgrim's head a second before hearing the click of the shot. Fulgrim's black eyes rolled back. In the shadows of the upper tier of the theatre sat those whose presence was unknown to anyone else on the planet. The two Astartes, Raven Guard Sharokin and Iron Warriors warrior Sabek Violand. Of course, to hope to kill a Primarch with a single headshot would be quite naive, yet Sharokin decided that the attempt was at least worthy of an effort. The Primarch survived, and the inevitable hunt for the Loyalists began, during which Sharokin and Violand managed to escape and take refuge on a ship called the Sisypheum. The Sisypheum became a haven for the survivors of Istvan from the 10th Legion, and despite the fact that the Emperor-loyal Astartes did not possess sufficient resources to openly fight 2 full-blooded legions, they made the decision to prevent the traitors from seizing the weapon. Moreover, it turned out that they also had a guide, the brother of the traitorous Eldar. The command bridge of the Iron Blood was framed by a column reaching to its supports without any adornment, upon which, tier by tier, rose riveted platforms. Augmented servitors, offering service to the simpler devices of the ship, were stationed on them. Where a post-human reaction was required, the Iron Warriors worked, though of this handful of legionaries, Perturabo knew only a few. He stood, arms crossed over his chest, dispassionately observing the swirling flares, incomprehensible streams and vortices in the warp substance displayed on the viewing screen. The unified fleet of the Iron Warriors, sons of the Emperor, had taken a position at the very edge of the maelstrom, whose blazing core shone like a dying star, and the rumbling corona expanded to engulf everything around. The right light emitted by the core illuminated Perturabo's face, giving it a ruddy hue of health and reflecting with fire in his cold eyes. For the first time in his life, Perturabo looked at the maelstrom and knew that others saw it too. Yes, they saw it differently than he did, but at least they acknowledged that this phenomenon existed. His gaze revealed planets floating within the dark light, ghosts flickering on the edge of perception, unstable firmaments in a realm that hated constancy. He saw planets on which neither logic nor Euclidean axioms applied, on which the physical laws governing the galaxy became playthings for forces beyond human comprehension. The journey to the Eye of Terror proceeded almost without incident, with the exception of the rather unexpected resurrection of Eidolon and the visit of the Iron Warriors to Andronicus, like the ship of the Emperor's children. However, within the Eye itself, the traitors encountered a ship of the Iron Hands, which had inadvertently revealed itself due to the reckless actions of an Iron Father named Tamatica, who released a powerful electromagnetic pulse as a result of a failed experiment. Upon discovering the ship, Perturabo ordered it to be simply fired upon from a safe distance. However, Fulgrim objected, as he did not wish to deny his warriors the pleasure of killing some loyal Astartes, and brought the ship to the firing line, preventing Perturabo from commencing the bombardment. Here, the perversion of the Third Legion revealed itself once more. In the first wave of the boarding action, the Emperor's children unleashed the Tirata, mutants that were once Astartes legionaries, horrifying creations of Fabius Bile, who was already obsessed with the idea of creating a new humanity. From the first torpedo that fell, a writhing mass of mutilated flesh and various types of armor burst forth. About 100 or slightly more creatures, unlike anything Cybus had ever seen. His artificial eyes were capable of transmitting visual information in several spectrums and with superb clarity. And now he regretted this. They looked different, but all were hybrid monsters with glistening flesh, deformed bodies and swollen muscles. They had removed their hands, replacing it with blades wrapped in chains, at the ends of which hooks swung, and they moved with incredible speed, some on legs that resembled organic springs, others on powerful red limbs like those of pack animals. In their pliable bodies, as if in wax figures forgotten by a hot lamp, parts of bodies from hundreds of different creatures had merged. Genetics had spawned vile beings undeserving of life. Among these creatures was Captain Cassander, who, though retaining remnants of his mind, could no longer resist the instincts and rage that had become an integral part of his new body. He began to kill loyal Emperors Astartes, and until the end of his now brief life, he would hate himself for it. Cassander roared and tore the bolts from the iron grip of a space marine. He broke the weapon in half, cast aside the broken halves, and leapt at the unarmed warrior. The helmet shattered from the first blow, the second one tore it off along with the collarbone. Compressed gases hissed from the exposed face, composed half of metal, half of flesh. The expression of hatred on the opponent's face halted Cassander's furious onslaught. Suddenly, the space marine found a long combat knife in his hand. The warrior struck Cassander in the side, and the tip, sliding over a bony shield, found a vulnerable spot and pierced one of the lungs. Blood splattered on the face of the Iron Hands. Cassander lowered his hand, grabbed the warrior's throat, and tore it out, ripping through the glistening tubes and spraying arterial blood. Using the last remnants of his life force, the Space Marine stabbed Cassander twice more with the knife, but the blows lacked strength. The blade slipped from his hand, and life left the warrior. Cassander rose to his feet, watching as coagulating blood dripped from the mass of arterial tissues clutched in his fist. He threw them aside with disgust and horror as he realized what he had done. A servant of the Imperium had fallen by his hand, an unthinkable act that barely registered in his mind. Felix Cassander, captain of the Imperial Fists, had killed a warrior of the Iron Hands. Oily tears streamed down his face and his stomach twisted in a spasm. He threw back his head and roared, paying no attention to the bloody and brutal battle unfolding around him. Among these frenzied monsters, Cassander was the only one who understood how horrifying Apothecary Fabius's experimentations had been for them. However, Sisypheum had withstood it. Noticing the critical overload and the danger of engine explosion, the traitors evacuated the ship, deciding it was not worth perishing alongside the desperate Iron Hands, who, as it turned out, had no intention of blowing up the ship. The automated systems managed to use the engine's excess energy to propel the Sisypheum and ram it into the Andronicus, destroying it. The Iron Hands were able to withdraw from the battle thanks to Perturabo, who refused to fire upon the loyalist vessel. He watched as the Iron Hands ship maneuvered with ease that seemed undeserving for such an ungainly creation. Leaving behind a trail of searing plasma and debris magnetically tethered, the Sisypheum set on a descending arc towards the storm clouds, which did not appear as a straightforward path. "Lord," said Krager, his finger hovering over the launch button. "Fire?" "No," replied Perturabo. "Leave them. They have earned it." Though this short battle had been a surprise for the traitors, it could not stop them from their goal, as it was equally unexpected for the enemy. The Legion ships arrived at Idris, the Eldar tomb world. Despite Fulgrim's protests, Perturabo ordered an orbital bombardment, scorching everything within a 100-kilometer radius of their target. In the end, the Phoenix summoned the 4th Legion to take the Eldar stronghold, and the Iron Warriors would wage war by their rules. However, Idris was empty. The planet greeted the invaders with nothing but dead silence and wind. The only reminders of the Eldar were empty structures and numerous statues. While in a typical situation, the absence of resistance would be considered good news, in this case it was a serious cause for concern. Perturabo never suffered from naivety, and understood that Fulgrim had lied to him from the start. But he still hoped for at least a grain of truth in his words. At the very least, they had called him here to fight. As for the Phoenix's own warriors, they were simply bored beyond measure. Lucius began to move even faster, so that every turn, every strike blended into a whirlwind of purple armor and silver blade. The swordsman whirled around the figures that adorned the road, reveling in the admiring glances of his fellow legionaries and the restrained respect of the Iron Warriors. He swept through the entire mausoleum, maneuvering between crystalline statues, and at the end of his path he leapt into the air, whipping his lash. The spiked strap wrapped around the statue's neck at the building's corner and cleanly severed its head. But before it could fall, Lucius's sword cleaved it in half. The halves shattered upon impact with the ground in an explosion of brilliant glass shards. After this execution, Lucius landed lightly on his feet, moving the hand holding the sword behind his back and allowing the whip to coil on the pavement. Lucius bent over the smooth ruby lying among the shards of the severed head. The stone was warm to the touch, and he laughed, sensing the panic emanating from within. It seemed the stone was afraid. The Space Marine grasped the stone and smirked as the panic within crystallized into terror. "What's this?" asked Berosso, extending his hand. Shrugging, Lucius placed the stone into his outstretched palm. The artifact vibrated as if caught in the flow of harmonic descent, and in its dance it became similar to a magnet changing polarity. Then, with a sharp crack, it shattered in Berosso's hand, and Lucius gasped, feeling a sudden surge of energy piercing through his body. This feeling was stronger than any combat stimulant, and the ecstatic bliss on Berosso's face made it clear he felt it too. The cacophonic weapons roared with deafening force, and half a dozen statues nearby shattered into pieces as if struck by a hammer. Among the tiniest shards into which each figure had turned, there lay similar gemstone hearts, and the howling cacophonies immediately pounced on the spoils. They fought for each artifact, pushing and tearing at one another with claws, grabbing the heat-emitting gems. Once in hand, the stone immediately exploded, causing an ecstasy that made the blood of all nearby warriors boil. Their weapons thrummed and buzzed, shrieking in animal enjoyment, and the atonal echo darted between the tombs, filling the streets like a pack of hungry hounds. Lucius stepped away from his brother as he pulled a sickle from his shoulder. The long shaft was enveloped in a shimmering blue light, and the body hummed with energy. Berosso struck the weapon with his hand, and a discharge of noise, accompanied by lightning, tore through the air with furious disharmony. The facade of the tomb cracked, and the shockwave blasted a crater 10 meters wide in the roadway. The news of the wondrous stone's value spread among the Emperor's children like a virus, and the initially uneven but persistent advance turned into a frenzied brawl, a true orgy of destruction, as the legionaries toppled every statue they could reach and shattered them into pieces. Eldris was an Eldari tomb, and the Xenos bury their dead in ways entirely unlike humans. The stones inside the statues were none other than spirit stones, which would later play a significant role. Having met no resistance, the traitors reached the complex, at the heart of which, according to Fulgrim's tales, lay the sought-after weapon. It was precisely there that one of the true reasons why the Phoenician needed Perturabo was revealed. A labyrinth of distorted space led to the center of the complex, in which even a Primarch would be doomed to eternal wandering through the corridors. However, Perturabo knew the principle by which the correct path could be found, as he had personally constructed a similar labyrinth using ancient blueprints, presumably authored by Leonardo da Vinci himself. However, as soon as the traitors reached the exit, they encountered the long-awaited resistance. The defenders of this place awoke, though the cause was those who had not even entered the complex. Julius and his warriors surrounded the fortress of the Fourth Legion. Thousands of hooting, screaming maniacs, holding their weapons and battle banners high, as if on the verge of eruption, like a singer ascending to a high note. The energy overflowing this world was ready to break free. Julius wanted to break the unknown barrier in its path so that this energy would flood the streets in a generous flow and drown them all. He burst into hysterical laughter and, drawing a knife, stabbed it into the space between the leather-clad shoulder pad and the scratched breastplate. The pain did not last long, nor did the bleeding, but he felt how every spilled drop increased the horror of this world. Bolstered by a confidence coming from somewhere outside, he realized that his blood was impregnated with something exceptional, something unbearable for the race that had created this city. His blood, his prayer, was tainted with the power that had come to life through the death of this race. And at that very moment, Julius knew what he had to do. The knife was too small, too inappropriate for this purpose, and he discarded it, drawing a sword with a jagged, spike-studded blade. He then raised a cry of loyalty to the kaleidoscope in the skies and rushed into the crowd of chanting warriors, his warriors. With the first blow, Julius cleaved one of Vairohana's cacophoniacs in half, and the body exploded in a burst of blood like a bursting bubble. With the second, he opened the belly of a warrior whose armor was so damaged it should have long been discarded. The third blow beheaded a champion with sides that looked like an ox, and fountains of blood from his neck spurted 3 meters into the air. Julius hacked and slashed his way through the throng of the Emperor's children, and with every severed artery, every severed limb, and every drop of spilled blood, his confidence grew that he was doing a good deed. He laughed, noticing that the Iron Warriors looked on in horror at this fratricide. Even their faceless, expressionless helmets could not hide their bewilderment. The senses were overwhelmed by the scent of blood and the strong sensation that they stood on the brink of something extraordinary. Following his example, the Emperor's children pounced on each other in a deadly orgy, and the lustful cruelty of murder pushed all notions of discipline or purpose from their minds. The spilled, warp-tainted blood, and the name of the dark god proclaimed, awoke the defenders of the planet. The statues of the Eldar scattered everywhere came to life and joined the battle against the traitors, both outside and inside the complex. Although the Tomb World's guardians individually could not compare to the Space Marines, and their actions lacked any semblance of organization, there were still plenty of them to bury both legions along with their primarchs. Perturabo knew that in a battle against these innumerable hordes, they were doomed to defeat. But what else could they do other than fight? His genetic father always said that a bad plan was better than none at all. And such a plan began to take shape in his mind as he continued to push back the Elder Wraith constructs. The creatures emerging from the towers exhibited no hesitation, but individually they could not pose a serious threat to the Iron Warriors. Perturabo saw that the creations enveloped in the glow from the columns of light were not sentient. They had been reanimated without any aspirations other than the urge to attack. They fought without strategy or plan. Their sole function was to kill the invaders, no matter how many of them fell in the process. They could be held back for a time, but their numerical superiority would eventually allow them to prevail. Not even Perturabo would survive an encounter with such a number of foes. But he knew that all was not yet lost. He stepped out from the ranks of the fighting and, along with the Iron Circle, marched back to the edge of the bottomless pit in the center of the hall. The Emperor's children, standing by the sloped path, raised their weapons as he approached, but Perturabo shook his head. "Kill them all," he said. The robotic warriors of the Iron Circle opened fire, knocking down all but one of the Emperor's children with shots from their heavy weapons and plasma guns. The broken bodies were swept up by the sheet of light as if by a swift river current. Before Perturabo's eyes, they soared into the darkness above and vanished. Perturabo shot the last warrior with a precise volley from the weapon mounted on his armoured gauntlet. He felt no remorse for killing the legionnaire. The latter had made his choice and went against Perturabo, a crime punishable by death, no matter which legion the soldier served. He strode to the edge of the pit, feeling the almost overwhelming power of the emerald light surging towards the singularity above. The remaining followers of Fulgrim glared at Perturabo with undisguised hatred, having discarded the masks of brotherhood, now rendered unnecessary as their leader embarked on the final stage of his deception. Below, the spiral path receded into the unknown, and Perturabo was almost ready to believe that it led to the very center of the world. As soon as this thought coalesced, he realized it was indeed so. It would lead him to the heart of the artificially created planet, where, since time immemorial, an object of Fulgrim's secret aspirations had been hidden from all mortal memory. Fulgrim had disappeared from sight in the chaos of the battle, yet within the vast hall there was only one place he could have gone, the deep shaft in the center. Unwilling to let the Phoenician claim whatever lay at the bottom alone, Perturabo descended after him. As it turned out, the planet Idris was hollow inside, the place of its core occupied by this colossal void, at the center of which shone an unbearably bright sun. Shadows cast by the bridges danced on the inner surface of the cavern, whose walls were studded with the same gemstones that guarded the surface. This was the source of light and the voices that tormented Perturabo on his way down with their sorrows. The walls, made of smoky fire-veined stone, were tinged green in the radiance of the immobile sun, the jewels in the inner shell of this spherical world forming an entire universe. Shimmering points surrounded Perturabo everywhere, both below and above his head. Stepping onto the bridge, he peered into the twilight chasm, from which glowing stones ascended leisurely, like phosphorescent deep-sea creatures. He staggered, experiencing dizziness for the first time, and waited a minute, slowing his breath until his spatial orientation adapted to the vastness of the space around, returning his balance. Then he continued across the bridge, no wider than a meter and as thick as a small tome. Both this and the other bridges in the hall arched in a graceful curve, corresponding to the golden ratio. Distances here, as on the path that brought Perturabo to this place, defied the physical laws of the universe, and he realized the titanic size of the green sun. He did not avert his gaze from the figure directly ahead, a shimmering silhouette against the blinding radiance. On the oval platform where the bridge ended stood Fulgrim, basking in the rays of the blazing sun. The entire story of Fulgrim had been a deception. There was no weapon here, and the angel exterminatus was yet to be born. This entire journey served but one purpose: ascension. The Primarch of the Third Legion craved rebirth, but to attain something so grand, one must sacrifice something equally precious. The fate of this sacrifice was destined for his brother, and although Perturabo would hardly have volunteered for this role, here, below, he no longer had a choice. Fulgrim's gift, the very mantle, adorned with the stone Mo guitar, had done its job perfectly, sapping a great portion of the Fourth Primarch's strength, and now nothing would deprive the Phoenician of his long-awaited perfection. The ritual began. Perturabo heard a crunch, as if many bones were breaking, and the shimmering lights above him shifted from their places. It seemed that the distant walls of the hall had begun to move, and a moment later he realized what was happening. A wave of mist, resembling the blurred veil of the moving outer spirals of a galaxy, morphed into something immeasurably more terrifying. All the gemstones that had previously adorned the walls now rushed towards the green sun, sparkling behind Fulgrim. The glittering stones flew like bullets, but a second before the impact, Fulgrim raised his palms, and the gems halted, forming an iridescent sphere around the sun. Its upper part remained open, and beyond its bounds, Perturabo saw only darkness. Had his vision blurred, or was it the light of the sun fading away? Like a sun that had exhausted its energy, the green star began to collapse catastrophically. Its surface roiled, resisting the changes, but Perturabo could see that the outcome of this struggle was predetermined. Fulgrim had absorbed the energy of this artificial sun, incapacitating the tomb's guards, and lifting his weakened brother into his arms, soared into the air and began ascending toward the shaft's exit. According to the Phoenicians' plan, nothing could interrupt the ritual now. However, one should never underestimate the creations of the Emperor himself. Even as he emerged from the shaft, mustering his remaining strength, Perturabo struck his brother, forcing him to release his grip. Perturabo felt himself being cast aside like some unholy thing. His energy and blood were not inexhaustible, but using the power he managed to reclaim, he reached for what he knew was dearest to Fulgrim. He clenched his fist, and everything vanished. The battle above had long since died down. The elder statues, suddenly motionless, no longer posed a threat, and the sight of the Primarchs threw the surviving Space Marines into stupor. Only Eidolon, who had received clear instructions from the Phoenician, knew what needed to be done. Eidolon drew a sword from beneath his cloak, a grey, mournfully glimmering blade that Lucius immediately recognized. Such a weapon could kill a god, and in ancient times a similar sword was considered enchanted. Anatheme was a shadow of the two-handed sword that, according to rumors, had been stolen from the Hall of Apparatus on Zenobia. The chaplain of the 17th Legion had shortened the blade to the size of a typical gladius, though no one knew why this was done. Eidolon raised the anatheme to Fulgrim's eyes and muttered something, but Lucius did not catch the words. The Primarch nodded, and Eidolon plunged the blade into the Primarch's side. The Emperor's children cried out in unison but did not move, held in place by the extraordinary force emanating from the divine figure. Moving in a circle, Eidolon continued to drive the blade into the Primarch's body, each time plunging it in up to the hilt. Fulgrim bled profusely, and his face betrayed the agony caused by each stab. Returning the bloodied weapon to its sheath, Eidolon stood before the Primarch and tore the edges of the first wound apart with his hands. Throwing his head back, Fulgrim let out a furious scream that could rival Angron's roar. No butcher's nails could have forced a living creature to scream like that. And Lucius swore he would kill Eidolon for torturing the Primarch in this manner, but it was not yet over. Eidolon again paced around Fulgrim with blood-slicked gauntlets, pulling apart the edges of each wound until the Primarch staggered on his feet, nearly falling. By sheer force of will, he restrained his own metabolism, preventing the wounds from healing. Lucius could not comprehend the purpose of this torture, but could tell that the process was nearing completion, judging by the power filling the hall. That power, once unleashed, could finally reveal itself to the world, whose dead guardians had restrained it for centuries. Eidolon raised his hand, and an entire constellation of gemstones detaching from the main mass of stones under the hall's vault rushed towards him. Snatching the stones from the air, he began to plunge them one by one into the wounds inflicted on the Primarch's flesh. Lucius caught fleeting flashes of terror and despair, but these echoes vanished with each new stone Eidolon placed into Fulgrim's body. First 10, then another 10, and more, until it seemed no more could fit. Fulgrim's flesh bulged with absorbed souls, but Eidolon continued to pull them from the air and thrust them into the wounds. Finally, Eidolon finished, and Lucius exhaled convulsively. "One more," Fulgrim whispered, "the stone of Maugatar." The stone imbued with Perturabo's strength was to be the final source of energy crucial for the ritual, yet during the ascension, the weakened Primarch managed to tear it out. Not knowing what would happen if the stone were destroyed, Perturabo decided to simply throw it back into the shaft, knowing that Fulgrim would be unable to retrieve it now. Ironically, Iron Hands hindered him. He tossed Maugatar into the shaft. Flaring golden, then black, the stones spun and arced towards the abyss's center. Fulgrim cried out in protest, and this scream shattered the stupor that gripped all the warriors. Perturabo's throw was weak, worse than his old colleagues, but it was enough. He watched Maugatar's descent and felt relief at ridding himself of the parasitic talisman. But relief turned to horror as beneath the flowing canopy of soul stones, a golden spectre followed Maugatar. It was a mechanical eagle with feathers of glittering gold, its body a wondrous fusion of spring-driven mechanics and long-forgotten technologies. In its design, Perturabo recognized the handiwork of the same genius whose mechanism he had recreated in his own sanctuary. It seemed he was not the only one inspired by the ancient sage from Furunza. With a predatory cry, the bird extended its talons and, clanging its wings, plunged to snatch Maugatar with its Stian claws, then sharply pivoted in midair. Its mechanical eyes glowed with intelligence born of hybrid technologies, and each wing beat was accompanied by the clangor of metal. Grasping the stone, the eagle flew towards the hall's far side. The mechanical bird was intercepted by Lucius, who brought it down with precise bolter fire. Seizing the stone, he began carving a path to his master. However, at that moment he was intercepted by Sharokin. The Raven Guard proved more than a match for the Legion's best swordsman, and with some effort Sharokin managed to defeat Lucius and capture the stone. The Iron Hands were mired in combat with the Emperor's children and Iron Warriors, exchanging lightning volleys of fire with them. Sharokin hurriedly checked the ammunition. The sooner he could discard this weapon, the better. Sharokin aimed the muzzle at the black and gold stone. He pulled the trigger and the Morgatar exploded. The destroyed stone released all the power contained within, bringing Perturabo back to his senses and serving its original purpose, acting as a catalyst for ascension. Fulgrim's body arched. The Morgatar contained not only the energies stolen from Perturabo, it held their combined essences, a power greater than the sum of its parts, a power that would ensure an ascension so unimaginable that only the life energy of two Primarchs could provide it. The armor on Fulgrim burned away, peeling off like golden dust in a hurricane wind, until the monstrously bloated, heat-scorched body was laid bare. Ethereal flames, shimmering in pink and violet, swirled around, ready to devour him the moment he let his guard down. Perturabo leaned on his fists, held on only by one iron will in his soul. The returning strength filled his bones with a weight, as if some burden had been laid on his shoulders without his knowledge. He rose, mastering more of the power flowing into the shadow with each passing second. Muscles filled with blood and golden energy, the heart beat with the force of a forge hammer. After what seemed like a lifetime, Perturabo felt the same as when he first met the Emperor, omnipotent and all-believing, endowed with the exceptional right to know who he truly was. Much had changed since then, but enough remained the same that, rising with the forge breaker on his shoulder, he felt joy in knowing he was doing the right thing. He flexed his fingers and allowed himself a few moments to admire the intricate craftsmanship. Horus had given him this weapon as a symbol of their alliance, but could he have imagined that Perturabo would use it to kill one of his brothers? Fulgrim saw his death in Perturabo's eyes and grinned, glowing with silver light from within. "You know what you must do?" "This had to be avoided," said Perturabo. "You understand it yourself that it can't be avoided," said Fulgrim, "so do it quickly." Perturabo nodded and raised the forge breaker like an executioner at a beheading. The steel-gold head of the hammer, tracing a geometrically perfect arc, split the Phoenician's body in two, and that was the end. But no, it was not yet the end. From the hammer's blow, Fulgrim's body exploded, and the cry that sounded was the scream of birth. From the remains of the Phoenician erupted a flash of pure energy, filling the hall with an unbearably bright, all-penetrating light. Like a newborn sun, this extraordinary brilliance became the center of everything, a fiery rebirth, new flesh created from the ashes of the old. The light intensified and Perturabo took a step back. White phosphorus dripped from his hammer, and he realized that the intoxicating power he had felt when destroying Mogatar was but a shadow of what was being created in this radiance. The eyes of everyone in the hall turned to the source of light, even though surely it would cost them their sight or even their minds. Shielding their eyes from the brilliance with their hands, watching it in flickering reflections, the surviving warriors observed something both magnificent and horrific, an agonizing death and a cruel birth fused into one. From the center of the luminescence came cries, more terrifying than anything else, embodying loss, pain, despair and regret for what was eternally forgotten. Perturabo felt that the devilish tones and suffering in those screams spoke of the newborn's fear of leaving the womb, of the terror before an unknown pain-filled world, and simultaneously of a desire to explore this world. This same ecstasy is experienced by a flesh sculptor, knowing no laws in his art other than to exalt himself through his work. When the scream of pain and ecstasy reached a limit beyond which it could no longer continue, the light began to unfold, like the petals of a nocturnal flower or a glowing cocoon, releasing a metamorphic creature. In the center of the radiance floated a certain being, and Perturabo did not immediately comprehend how incredible what he was seeing truly was. It was Fulgrim, naked in pristine purity, having shed the vulgar patterns with which he had marred his flesh, rendering him as perfect as he had once been created by the Emperor. At the sight of the Phoenician, even the greatest sculptors would have had to cast aside their tools, for they could not have sculpted anything so beautiful. The wounds inflicted by Eidolon had left no trace. When Fulgrim lowered his hands, the reflections of long-dead worlds glistened in his eyes. He threw back his head, and millions of soulstones, rising along with him from the planet's core, shattered with a deafening crack. In their vanishing, they sacrificed their energy to the light, amplifying it many times over so that a shimmering silver web formed around Fulgrim, for the whisper of a god which Barb turned into Kring. Fulgrim's back arched, and bones snapped with a loud crunch. Flesh, recently seeming so perfect, became fluid and mutable. His body constantly changed shapes, as if an invisible sculptor were moulding it like clay on his wheel. Fulgrim's legs, stretched like those of a Verturian man, elongated and fused into a serpentine tail, and his skin thickened and became covered in scales, forming segments of chitinous armor. Perturabo stepped forward towards this creature, born at the cost of Fulgrim's life, with a desperate suspicion that this might indeed be his brother. On this entire planet of the dead, abandoned after a star cataclysm, only hoping that its creators would one day return for the remains of their ancestors, every soul stone entombed in grave or sculpture screamed in terror. Life hidden within these stones devoured a deity whose hunger was insatiable, the one who yearns. Offerings and sacrifices, feasts and fuel, and much more. This was the exchange Fulgrim gave for his apotheosis. His torso opened up, filling with writhing cords of muscle, and growths of flesh made their way outside from his ribs. Gelatinous and agile, they grew from the ever-changing flesh, initially resembling withered limbs, but gradually transforming into muscular arms. Their skin had a purple hue, and from the black claws, poison hissed as it dripped. But the worst was yet to come. When Fulgrim bent over from the pain accompanying this transformation, light surged back into him, streaking his body like cracks on the sun, and burst forth from his back in two gigantic wings, membranous and translucent. Pierced by dark energy, they seemed fragile, but gradually gained solidity, a substance of the warp that found a form in which it could exist in the real world. This body was no longer composed of flesh and blood, as Perturabo had destroyed Fulgrim's mortal shell. It was an avatar of light and energy, soul and desire. The event was an act of will, for the being created itself solely through its own thirst for existence. The being was both its own father and mother, truly an immaculate conception or conjunction, an alchemical union of soul, spirit and body. Fulgrim's face turned into a mask of agonizing ecstasy, which compelled him to endure pain for the pleasure to come. From his skull, precisely at the spots where the sniper bullet had passed during the Teleocron assassination attempt, two obsidian horns grew. They curved back, so that his perfect face still looked innocent, like that of a child. "This is my ascension into chaos and the form of the unborn," he said. In his apotheosis, Fulgrim absorbed the energy of all the soul stones of the planet. Millions of Eldar souls were fed to the Dark God and became fuel for the ritual. Whatever the plans of the Xenos that brought the Astartes here, they failed. The Phoenician ascended to demonhood, completely destroying the tomb and condemning all its inhabitants to the most dreadful fate for them. The Primarch was reborn along with his legion, utterly devoid of any chance for repentance.